the death that started everything, because Alex Preddy wasn't just any healthcare worker. She worked at a major Minneapolis hospital system. And when her death became a flashpoint for people who saw it as federal overreach, when it became one of those TikTok moments where millions of people see injustice happening in real time, something unexpected happened. Audience, what do you mean unexpected? Nobody organized a strike. There was no union hall meeting, no formal strike authorization from labor leadership. What happened was workers made a collective decision independently using social media, encrypted chat, and their own judgment about their power. And then they exercised it. The spontaneous shutdown, how it actually happened. Within hours of Alex Preddy's death becoming public, Target distribution centers in Minneapolis went completely offline. Not because a union called a strike, because workers showed up to work and didn't log in. Audience, that's it. They physically showed up, they gathered, they discussed. And they collectively decided not to work. No dramatic walkout, no picket lines initially, just silent non-cooperation. Delta flight crews in Minneapolis called in sick on the same day. Pause. Think about that. Flight crews, one of the most regulated, most disciplined parts of American labor, made an independent decision that they weren't going to work today. And they coordinated it without union authorization, without strike calls. Just individual decisions that somehow coordinated perfectly. Housekeeping staff at Hilton properties across the entire upper Midwest did the same thing. Hotels literally couldn't function. Rooms weren't clean. Conventions couldn't be held. The hospitality sector in Minnesota just stopped. Here's where it gets serious. Audience, there's a serious part. There's a very serious part. One city becomes national crisis in 72 hours. A single metropolitan area's labor disruption cascaded into something national within 72 hours. Pause. 72 hours. That's 3 days. That's how fast the system broke. Why did a Minneapolis problem become a national problem so quickly? Because Minnesota isn't just a random state. Minnesota is a logistics hub. It's one of the critical choke points in American supply chains. Target's distribution network feeds supply chains across the entire Midwest and beyond. Audience. So when workers in Minneapolis stop working, it doesn't just affect Minneapolis. It affects what's on store shelves in Kansas City. It affects what's available in Chicago. It affects the entire regional supply chain. Delta's Minneapolis hub is one of the largest in the country. When crews call in sick at a major hub, connecting flights get disrupted nationwide. If you were trying to fly from Denver to Atlanta through Minneapolis, your flight got canceled. If you were trying to get from Phoenix to Boston with a layover in Minneapolis, disrupted. One city, one hub, national impact. This is what logistics experts call hub concentration. It sounds boring. It's actually terrifying from a management perspective, because it means your entire system's vulnerability is concentrated in a handful of geography. And if those geographies have workers who decide to coordinate, you have a systemic problem. Why this is different from 1946. Now, historians will point out that we've had labor disruptions before. Audience, like the 1946 strike wave. After World War II, millions of servicemen came back to the workforce, and labor coordinated across steel, coal, railways, automobiles, hundreds of thousands of workers. Those strikes lasted months. They fundamentally reshaped labor agreements for a generation. But here's what's critical. In 1946, strikes were slow-moving. They required organizational infrastructure. You needed union halls. You needed newsletters. You needed time to build consensus. That took weeks. That meant union leadership had control. That meant negotiations could actually happen. The 1946 wave eventually got contained because it was organized through traditional channels that management understood and could negotiate with. But what we saw in Minneapolis, pause. This doesn't fit that framework at all. Digital coordination changes everything. When a healthcare worker's death becomes a TikTok moment, when Gen Z workers can coordinate a distribution center shutdown in 90 minutes through encrypted chat, when labor action can scale faster than management can communicate, the traditional leverage points disappear entirely. Think about this. Your supply chain director gets the call that Minneapolis workers aren't showing up. She calls an emergency meeting. That meeting takes 2 hours to organize. By the time the meeting happens, the disruption has already cascaded to 4 other states. By the time she can communicate a response, the situation has evolved twice. The traditional management advantage, information control, communication speed is gone. American companies spent 30 years optimizing supply chains for something. What were they optimizing for? Pause. Efficiency. Which means they also optimize for fragility. Walmart's just-in-time inventory system. You've heard about it, right? It's not a feature. It's a vulnerability. When Walmart can deliver fresh produce to stores faster than competitors, that's great. Until the day workers in a warehouse decide to exercise leverage. Then that same system that was supposed to be efficient becomes a choke point. Target's distribution network, which was celebrated in the 2000s as a model of logistics efficiency, becomes a critical vulnerability the moment workers in Minneapolis decide they want something changed. You optimized for speed, you forgot about resilience. That's a management mistake, and management just paid for it. The shift in labor market power. Here's the thing that keeps logistics experts awake at night. The labor market fundamentally changed, and nobody in executive suites was paying attention. During the 2000s and 2010s, supply chain workers were considered interchangeable. Audience? Interchangeable? Absolutely. You had an oversupply of labor. Automation was coming. The conventional wisdom was that workers would have less power, not more. That's what every business school taught. That's what the economic model said. Workers were supposed to become less valuable, not more. Then 2020 happened, and suddenly those workers became essential infrastructure. Pandemic lockdowns meant that the people moving goods became literally critical to survival. Suddenly, a warehouse worker isn't just replaceable labor. A warehouse worker is a literal lifeline. And something shifted in how those workers understood their own value. Audience. So they realized they actually mattered. By 2024, Gen Z was making up a much larger portion of warehouse, logistics, and service sector workforces. And these workers didn't grow up in an era of union solidarity. They grew up in an era of platform power. They understand asymmetric leverage. They understand viral moments. They understand that if you control something essential and the other side is unprepared, you have leverage. The corporate panic. Day 1 to day 7, when the Minnesota disruption happened in January 2026, corporate leadership was completely unprepared. Not because they didn't have contingency plans written down. They had contingency plans, entire binders. But those plans assumed traditional labor action. They assumed you'd know 30 days in advance. They assumed there would be negotiation windows. They assumed the action would stay geographically contained. None of those assumptions were correct. Within 5 days, Target's CEO made a public statement about operational challenges. Operational challenges? That's corporate code. That's what you say when you're losing money and you don't know how to fix it. You never say we're in crisis. You say operational challenges. Everyone in business understands that means panic. By day 7, a full week into this, something unprecedented happened. A major American corporation publicly negotiated working conditions and compensation with workers who had organized themselves entirely through social media. There were no union representatives in the traditional sense. There were no formal negotiation structures. There were just workers who coordinated through TikTok and encrypted chat, and a corporation realizing that the cost of not negotiating was existential. The capitulation that changed everything. And here's what nobody wants to say out loud. Target capitulated. Audience, they what? They gave in. Not on every demand, but on the core, as federal law enforcement operations would not target employees or their families without prior coordination with corporate HR. Think about what that means. A private corporation Target negotiated with the federal government on behalf of its workers because the cost of not negotiating was incalculable. Supply chain disruption, revenue loss, reputational damage. It was cheaper to negotiate something that should theoretically be outside their authority than to let the disruption continue. But the real damage wasn't to Target. It was to every other logistics company in America. The signal spreads. System-wide vulnerability Target's capitulation sent a signal across the entire logistics sector. If your workers have the ability to organize digitally, and if your supply chain is optimized for efficiency rather than resilience, then you have a vulnerability that can be exploited in 72 hours. And that vulnerability scales nationally. Every major logistics company is now running war games. Audience. War games. Running scenarios. If our Memphis hub goes down, what happens? If our Houston port workers coordinate, can we handle it? And the answer for most companies is no, we cannot handle it. Which means they're panicking. This is where supply chain fragility enters the picture as a genuine national security issue. And the Department of Defense has known this for years. When they commissioned studies on supply chain vulnerability, they weren't looking for foreign countries. They weren't looking for cybersecurity threats primarily. The bottlenecks they identified were labor dependent. A disruption in semiconductor logistics, labor dependent. A disruption in pharmaceutical supply chains, labor dependent. A disruption in food distribution, labor dependent. All of these critical supply chains exist in specific geographies where workers have already shown they can coordinate. And suddenly, national security isn't about military might or cyber defenses. It's about whether workers in 5 American cities decide to exercise power. Delta's lesson. Hub vulnerability. Delta's experience in Minneapolis is particularly instructive for understanding this vulnerability. Flight crews represent one of the most critical labor forces in American infrastructure. These are regulated professionals. These are people who have institutional discipline. These are people you would think would never just call in sick in coordination. but they did. And when they did, disruption wasn't contained to Minneapolis. Within 48 hours of Delta's crew call-in, ripple effects were visible in airport delays from Denver to Atlanta. Passengers were stranded, connections were missed, connecting flights got canceled. The system froze. Audience. Because of one hub? Because of one hub. Because of coordinated individual decisions by professionals in one geography. And here's the critical part. Those crew members were never part of any formal strike authorization. They didn't violate contracts. They just exercised collectively their individual right to not show up. And they did it with enough coordination that Delta couldn't backfill the losses with replacement crews, because you can't train replacement flight crews in 48 hours. The system requires human expertise that takes years to develop. Hilton, the hospitality shock. The Hilton situation was even more revealing because it happened in a sector that was supposed to be the least organized. Hospitality workers, housekeeping, food service, maintenance are traditionally among the least unionized sectors in the American economy. The turnover is high, the wages are low, the organizational strength is weak. But hospitality workers demonstrated they could execute a coordinated action that created tangible costs for a major corporation. Hotel occupancy dropped. Convention planners started looking at alternative cities. By day 10 of the disruption, Hilton was in active negotiations with worker representatives who literally emerged from the action itself, rather than traditional union leadership. That's the scary part for management. You don't know who you're negotiating with. They're not institutional figures. They're workers who decided to represent themselves, which means they're not bound by the deals previous union leaders might have made. They can ask for things that haven't been negotiated in decades. The economics, wage-setting power returns. What happened in Minneapolis is a textbook case of what economists call wage-setting capacity, and this is where everything is really interesting for the American economy. Before 2026, the conventional wisdom was locked in. Wage-setting power had shifted to capital, globalization, automation, supply chain fragmentation. All of these trends meant that workers had less negotiating power than at any time since the 1920s. Wages stagnated, benefits eroded. You lived with the power relationship as it was. That seemed permanent. But you can only sustain that power dynamic if workers are actually replaceable and if they're dispersed. The moment you concentrate essential labor in specific hubs, and the moment you give workers the communication tools to coordinate faster than management can react, that power dynamic inverts. Suddenly, workers have more leverage than they've had in decades. The ripple effects, what comes next? And this is just the beginning, because there are larger systemic implications that almost nobody's thinking about yet. First implication, inflationary pressure from below. If workers in logistics, transportation, and service sectors succeed in demonstrating wage-setting power, the pressure will spread to other sectors. Healthcare workers will see what happened and mobilize. Retail workers will organize. Construction workers will do the same. And unlike the 2000s when labor was genuinely weak, these workers will have proof that coordination works. That fundamentally changes bargaining dynamics across the entire economy. What you're looking at is inflation being driven not from the top, not from government spending, not from monetary policy, but from the bottom. Workers exercising power, demanding higher wages. Companies unable to resist because workers control critical infrastructure, raising prices to cover those wage increases. That's a very different inflation dynamic than what we're used to. Second implication, automation, acceleration, and consolidation. Capital will accelerate automation in some sectors and resist it in others. In sectors where labor has demonstrated power, companies will absolutely double down on automation spending, but automation takes years to implement. You can't automate a warehouse overnight. You can't automate flight crews. During those years of transition, companies operating in those sectors will see margin compression. That means some companies fail. That means consolidation. That means market concentration in sectors where only the largest players can afford the automation transition. This creates a weird dynamic where big companies get bigger and workers working for big companies get more leverage because big companies can afford to negotiate. Smaller companies either disappear or get absorbed. It's a form of creative destruction, but the creative part benefits capital and the destruction part benefits workers, at least temporarily. Third implication, geographic power becomes geopolitical power. This is the critical one. If labor power is concentrated in certain metros, and it is because distribution hubs are geographically concentrated, then those metros become geopolitically important in ways they absolutely were not before. Minneapolis matters now because workers can leverage the supply chains flowing through there. Oakland matters because port labor has strategic choke point power. Los Angeles matters because of port operations. Memphis matters because of FedEx logistics. These aren't just economic centers anymore. They're leverage points in geopolitics. If you want something from the United States as a foreign power, you don't have to attack the military. You have to understand which American cities control critical infrastructure. And you have to understand that those cities have workers who have leverage. Connecting to the bigger picture. Now let's connect this to something much larger that's been happening for 4 years. The Biden administration spent years talking about reshoring and friendshoring, bringing manufacturing back to America, building redundancy in supply chains, all the right strategic concepts, all smart policy on paper. But there was a massive blind spot. They were assuming that supply chains are managed by capital and government. They weren't accounting for the fact that supply chains are actually maintained by people. And people have leverage, and people, especially younger workers who've never internalized Cold War era American exceptionalism, aren't afraid to use it. In 1946, when the strike wave happened, it ultimately led to the post-war settlement. Strong unions, predictable labor relations, integrated supply chains operated by companies with defined relationships with organized labor. That settlement lasted 30 years before it broke down in the 1970s and got dismantled throughout the 1980s and 1990s. What we're seeing in 2026 is the emergence of something that looks like a new settlement in its early stages. It's not formalized yet. There are no grand agreements, but the logic is becoming clear. Workers have leverage. That leverage is geographic. It's concentrated in logistics hubs. It scales digitally, and it works faster than traditional management structures can respond to. The fundamental shift companies are going to adapt. Some will negotiate early. Some will resist and face disruptions. Some will accelerate automation and deal with transition costs. But the fundamental dynamic has shifted. And here's what policymakers need to understand. You cannot bring supply chains back to America without bringing workers back into the power equation. Because American workers, especially younger American workers, who've never accepted the neoliberal settlement that was imposed on them, have shown they know how to exercise power. That's not a bug in the reshoring strategy. That's a feature. That's actually how capitalism works when you have a functioning labor market. The real vulnerability in the American system is in China. It's not cybersecurity threats, though those are real. The real vulnerability is that American power is increasingly dependent on supply chains that are maintained by workers who've discovered they have leverage they never had before. And that leverage, once discovered, doesn't go away. It gets normalized. It becomes part of the baseline operating environment. The signal, what happened in Minneapolis in January 2026, wasn't an aberration. It wasn't a one-time event. It was a signal. It was a market discovering a new equilibrium, a new power relationship. And the companies and governments that understand this first will adapt successfully. The ones that don't are going to face surprises because they're going to keep assuming that labor is a cost to be minimized rather than a power to be negotiated with. That's how supply chain fragility doesn't just become an economic issue. It becomes a strategic issue. It becomes a geopolitical issue. It becomes a story that explains why American power looks different in 2026 than it did in 2024. And that's the story nobody's telling until now. Workers didn't plan this revolution. They just discovered their power. And once you discover power, you don't give it back.